Good day. Today is Thursday, 25th September 2025, and the view which I expressed in my programme yesterday, and which of course has also been expressed by various others, that Donald Trump's notorious Truth Social post, the one in which he expressed the view that Ukraine is winning the war and can actually win the war and can take back all its territories and more besides, that post was ultimately, as Larry Johnson on Sonar 21 has said, a piece of sarcasm that is intended to conceal the fact that in reality, President Trump is trying to distance himself from the war. Well, that view today, I notice, has become mainstream. And we can see that in an article. In fact, as of the time of making of this program, it is the main article which appears in the Financial Times. And the title of the article is European Officials Fear Trump is Preparing to Blame Them for Ukraine Failure. And then the subtitle goes on to say, Poland's Tusk warns new US posture conceals a shift of responsibility. And we go on to read that several European officials concluded Trump was handing them responsibility for Ukraine's defense with expectations that Europe would find hard to meet. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk warned publicly that Trump's surprising optimism disguised a promise of reduced US involvement and a shift of responsibility for ending the war to Europe. Better truth than illusions. And then we go on to read, this is the start of a blame game, an interesting admission. A blame game, one official said, of Trump's abrupt change of heart. The United States knew that the China and India tariffs would be impossible for the EU to accept. Trump is building the off-ramp so he can blame Europe when and if he needs to, a European government aide said. The shift was spectacular and generally good, but Trump was setting a very high bar, a German official said. Trump wants to avoid, these are all quotes, Trump wants to avoid that after 9 months in power, this war becomes his war too, and no longer just Biden's war, said Carlo Massala, international affairs professor at the Bundeswehr University in Munich. And another European official said everyone sees Trump is disengaging. Well, the most interesting thing here, the most interesting observation in this article is the admission that the president is building an off-ramp so that he can blame Europe when and if he needs to, and that this is the start of a blame game. And that the Europeans, who often brag about how much richer they are than the Russians, how much more powerful they are than the Russians, all of those things, will find it impossible to, as the article says, meet Trump's expectations. Now, those things, blame games, recriminations, finger pointing, and shifting of responsibility, all of that happens in only one situation, where it is obvious to all concerned that a war is being lost. As some wise person once said, if victory has many fathers, defeat is an orphan. So normally, if we were looking at a situation where everybody expected that Ukraine was going to win the war, then everybody, in the West at least, would be jumping in and would be giving themselves the credit for the pending victory, and far from holding back, would be coming forward with more and grander and more generous offers of help. Far from running away from the war and from responsibility for the war, everybody in the West, that is, would be rushing to embrace it so that they could, all of them together, share the credit of victory. Now, I say all of that because I believe that Donald Trump himself and the top officials in the US government do realize that Ukraine is going to lose the war. There was an article that appeared about 2 or 3 weeks ago in one of the American media outlets, I forget which one, in which Trump supposedly told members of his team that eventually the Ukrainians would have to come round because the realities on the battlefield would oblige them to, and that they would be obliged to make a deal with the Russians, and since the Russians hold the advantage, that deal would be on Russian terms. So that article appeared, and it was not contradicted. There was no pushback against it that I'm aware of from the administration. So I believe that President Trump and his officials, or at least some of them, know and believe that Ukraine is going to lose this war, and that is why he is now looking for what a European official quoted by the Financial Times describes as an off-ramp. It is why Trump is trying to distance himself from the war. But look at the response in Europe. Are they taking out the champagne? Are they saying that the President of the United States says that Ukraine is going to win? Are they rushing to make further offers of help to Ukraine? No, they are all dismayed. They are horrified that Trump might indeed be looking for an off-ramp. They are talking about a blame game. They are engaging in recriminations. They talk about how a game of recriminations is in fact starting. It turns out that deep down, they don't believe that Ukraine is going to win either. And they complain bitterly that what Trump is asking them to do puts his, quotes, expectations of them at an impossibly high bar. So what this article has done in the Financial Times, and bear in mind that it is based on a huge variety of quotes from European officials, probably in Britain, but across Europe as well. Several German officials are explicitly identified. What this has done is it's a case of the mask suddenly dropping. We can see that for all the brave words, all the confident boasts, the war is in stalemate, Ukraine is actually winning, the Russians are suffering all these extraordinary losses, all of that, the European leadership secretly knows the same thing that the American leadership also knows, that the war in Ukraine is not being won, it is actually being lost. Now that brings me back to this perennial topic of my programs. Why, if they know that the war is being lost, which I think this article shows unmistakably is the case, why in that case do they persist in it? Why do they not do what any rational person would do in this situation, which is do the same thing that Donald Trump is criticized for doing, which is, quote, seek an off-ramp. Seek some way to extricate Europe, the various European states, from this losing war. Do they want to own the defeat? They're dismayed, in fact, when the Americans are throwing the whole burden upon them. They clearly don't want to own the defeat. What they want is for the Americans to own the defeat with them. The better to bind the Americans to themselves. But if the Americans are not going to do that, if Donald Trump is going to distance himself from all this, if they are going to be left holding this debacle, well, surely what they ought to be doing is exploring some way to put this debacle, this nightmare down, this weight down. After all, is it not often said that if you're carrying around a suitcase full of bricks, the simplest thing to do is to simply put it down? Surely that is what the European leaders ought to be doing. After all, they're worried about the situation in their own economies. They know that their own economies are now teetering on the brink of deep recessions. I have been reading today in various British newspapers about how a financial crisis might be round the corner. I have been reading in the British media how the situation in Britain politically is now so bad that the Labour politician Andy Burnham, a person, by the way, that I have little confidence in, to put it mildly, and am completely unimpressed by. Anyway, that he now says that he's currently receiving request after request from Labour MPs to come and directly challenge the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, for leadership of the Labour Party and to become Prime Minister. We see political and economic strains building up in Germany. Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor there, has delivered another great speech telling everybody in Germany how great reforms and changes must now be undertaken, how there must be massive cuts in public spending and all of those things, because otherwise Germany won't be able to move forward. As Wolfgang Munchau, that most astute of German commentators, has pointed out, none of this goes beyond cliches or can in any way be said to amount to any sort of plan. But the political strains in Germany are also there. There was, for example, a few days ago, a mayoral election in a town in the West German region of Rhineland-Pfalz, the town of Ludwigshafen, a town which is another town, by the way, I know quite well. Ludwigshafen, for those who don't know, which is a prosperous place, very much part of the heartland of Germany's current governing party, the CDU. Helmut Kohl, the former German Chancellor, was born there. He rose politically there. This was his hometown, and it was where he basically built his power base, rising eventually to become Minister President of the region of Rhineland-Pfalz, a major stepping stone in what eventually led him to become first leader of the CDU and then Chancellor. Anyway, there was a recent mayoral election in this town. It looked as if the AfD candidate might do rather well. So various legal steps were taken to ban this person from standing, and this was challenged in the courts unsuccessfully. I know nothing. I know none of the details of why this was done, or well, I could guess why it was done, but I know none of the details of the reasons given for seeking the ban against this person. Only the fact that he was banned, or she was banned. The result was that the mayoral election took place without a candidate from the AfD, and the people of Ludwigshafen responded by basically staying away from the polls. So the turnout was only around 30%, which is critically low for a German election. And around 10% of those who did vote spoiled their ballots, meaning that the successful CDU candidate now has limited legitimacy with the people of Ludwigshafen. So we see these stresses right across Europe. In country after country, the stresses grow. The economic stresses, the political stresses, all of them connected in some way to the war. You would think that they know that there is cause and effect, that these stresses are caused by the war. And this article in the Financial Times tells us that they know that the war is being lost. They also recognize that they are not in any position to retrieve the situation by themselves. If the mighty Americans are short of weapons to send to Ukraine, as articles in Reuters are confirming, if there are no more Patriot missile systems to spare to be sent to Ukraine, well, the leaders of Europe know, or ought to know, that they're not in a position to produce those weapons either. As Wolfgang Munchau, going back to him, also pointed out recently in an article which appeared in Unheard, if the Americans are not providing Ukraine with funding, this is going to create a massive funding gap. There's been some suggestions in Europe that the way to close this funding gap for perhaps 2 years would be to confiscate the Russian assets. Emmanuel Macron is now speaking out against this idea, and I understand that doubts are starting to grow about this idea in Germany again. So it might not happen after all. But then, what alternative is there? If the Americans are not going to write the checks, and the abilities of the Europeans to write the checks is becoming exhausted, where is the money that Zelensky and the Ukrainians need going to come from? I say that there's been an article in The Economist, of all places, which now admits, and this is the title, Ukraine faces deepening military, political and economic problems. And it talks about the growth of corruption, the decay of Ukraine's social and political institutions, the increasingly arbitrary and authoritarian system that President Zelensky of Ukraine has established, the fact that Ukraine, as the former British diplomat Ian Proud correctly says, and has been saying for years, by the way, that Ukraine is essentially bankrupt, that it is fiscally broken and exhausted, that it only survives as a result of massive fiscal transfers from the West. And as The Economist admits, the problem with that is that it is causing enormous and dangerous distortions within the economy itself, as always happens when fiscal spending is generated inorganically. And the article actually goes on to say that some Ukrainians worry that though Ukraine is clearly surviving, it is gradually being hollowed out and losing room for maneuver. I'm not sure how I reconcile claims that Ukraine is gradually being hollowed out and losing room for maneuver is really consistent with Ukraine surviving. Surely it is more a case of a slow death than survival. It's like talking about somebody who is in an advanced state of terminal illness surviving because they haven't yet died. Just saying. But anyway, we have a quote from a senior official. We can fight for years, losing positions slowly. They're not losing them that slowly. But then he goes on to say, but the question is why? And surely that is the question. That is the right question to ask at this time. Why sit back and allow Ukraine to die? Why create or intensify this economic, social, and political crisis in Europe? Why take ownership of the defeat if you are really worried and believe that President Trump and the Americans are walking away because they don't want to share the responsibility of the, or rather, shall I say, the blame for the defeat with you? Why not engage finally in diplomacy to find some way out? Let me say it again. The Russian terms so far, the terms which Putin has proposed, are not unreasonable. They are not impossible. They do not compromise European security interests. If Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Donbass become part of Russia, it is not going to lead tomorrow to the fall of Paris or Berlin. If NATO membership is not extended to Ukraine, it is not going to jeopardize the security of Britain or Spain. Why not agree to all of these things? Saving Ukraine, delivering Europe from this nightmare, providing some political and economic space so that the situation in Europe can be stabilized, and, well, follow the American lead in this. Well, that isn't going to happen. As Medvedev, by the way, said in certain comments that he made in response to Donald Trump's comments in his Truth Social post, Trump's words were ultimately the product of European obstruction of every step that the Americans, however chaotically, however confusedly, however insincerely, have been making over the last 9 months to try to extricate themselves, Ukraine, and perhaps even Europe from this impossible situation. Instead of assisting Trump in those endeavors, the Europeans have worked round the clock to try to sabotage him. And now, when they find that it looks as if he really is saying enough and is walking away, all they can do is talk about blame games, engage in recriminations, tell themselves that they're lost without the Americans, the defeat is round the corner, but they refuse in any way or in any form to change course. I'm sorry if I have again repeated myself at length here. I've said variants of these things for a fair amount of time, but I don't think one should overlook quite how weird, quite how bizarre ultimately this all is. Obviously, you could say a lot harder things about it. You could say that it is criminal and wrong, that tens of thousands of people, Ukrainians mostly, are dying in Ukraine for no useful purpose because defeat is now inevitable, that Ukraine is being, to use the words of The Economist, hollowed out and is losing room for manoeuvre to no useful purpose. You could say many worse things than that. But at a simple level of basic self-interest, this just doesn't make any sort of sense to me. Of course, when I talk about self-interest, I talk about the self-interest of the nations of Europe, not of the gaggle of politicians who have control of European affairs. They clearly see their own self-interest served through the prolongation of the war, not through its ending. But must we really tolerate the situation in Europe where the interests of the very great many are being sacrificed to the interests, the temporary interests, of a tiny elite few? Well, it seems so, because there is no political mechanism, no political force that I am aware of, in Europe at least, which at the moment appears to have the strength or the will or the organizational capacity or the clarity of mind to force a change. Anyway, it was a long discussion about what has happened. I ought to reiterate the point which I have made in my program yesterday. I do not like in any way what the President of the United States is doing. I think that using manipulative language, appearing to cheer on the Ukrainians as they pursue victory, whilst actually looking for the escape door, to me, well, I have problems with that at many, many levels. I don't see this as strength or as clarity of mind. There was that famous expression once made by the French politician and Prime Minister, Pierre Mendès France, to govern is to choose. Well, if to the extent that the President has made a choice, he's not prepared, even now, in spite of everything, to come out straightforwardly and tell us what it is. This on a question of war and peace, and over a conflict where he constantly writes articles and posts and makes comments and gives interviews in which he speaks about his great sorrow, about all of these people who are dying. Frankly, I find this, well, undignified, and I could come up with far stronger words to describe it than that. Moreover, I think that the President, by failing to make a clean break, by not being frank about the realities with the American people, and indeed with the American political class, far from being clever, as he perhaps thinks, is merely storing up further problems for himself in future. If Ukraine does go down, he will find that for whatever maneuvers he thinks he is engaging in as a result of this Truth Social post and some of the other things that he is saying, he will find that some of the blame is still going to be fasted upon him. But today, it's the leaders of Europe that make me frustrated, and I will admit, angry, but there it is. Anyway, the Russians have observed, they have watched, they can see all of these things. And interestingly, Over the last 24 hours, they have been doing more of what they have now increasingly started to do, which is that they've been providing more information about the state of the battlefield in various places. So they provided more information about Kupiansk. They say that over the last 24 hours, another 115 buildings in Kupiansk have been captured. And they appear to believe that the advance in Kupiansk is continuing, and it is continuing successfully. My own sense is that the Russians definitely believe that this battle for Kupiansk is almost over. The Russians have also said that they have defeated the Ukrainians near Liman, the town of Liman, also not far from Slavyansk, in a village called Zvarichne. They've described an extraordinary battle for control of this village. They say that the Ukrainians committed 3 of their brigades to defending their positions in this village. This despite the fact that Zvarichne is a small place. I have to say, this seems astonishing, but I presume it is true. 3 brigades, assuming that these brigades were up to strength, we could be looking at a force of between 6,000 and 9,000 men. Of course, Ukrainian brigades are not up to strength or anywhere close to that. Perhaps we're looking more realistically at a force of around 2,000 men. It is still a huge commitment of resources by Ukraine to defend this small village, which suggests that its fall will have consequences for the future development of the Battle of Liman and for the battle around Slavyansk. And the Russians also say, they've also provided a lot of more detail about the fighting south of the Kliban-Bik reservoir in the Konstantinovka area. They were saying a couple of days ago that 3,000 Ukrainian troops had been trapped in this area. Their latest report say that the number of Ukrainian troops had reduced in this area to around 800, and they identified them as mainly Azov and other special forces, so fairly elite troops. They say that out of that 800, only around 80 are now left, and that the Russians are now therefore on the brink of finally clearing the entire territory, right up to the banks of the reservoir itself, of the presence of the Ukrainians. I should stress that it does not follow that all of those 3,000 men who were originally there are dead or wounded or taken prisoner, though no doubt many of them are. It's likely that others have escaped. It's been suggested that some of them would have swum across the reservoir, or maybe they managed to hide and escape through the undergrowth. But there's no doubt at all that Ukrainian losses in this area have been extremely high. And, well, that's just some of the information now that the Russians continue to give us. The Russian Defense Ministry is now giving us in great detail and on a daily basis, it now seems, about developments on the battlefronts. A marked, radical change in the Russian approach to providing information about the war, and one wonders exactly why it has happened. Now, in my opinion, the key battleground remains Pokrovsk. The Russians, various Russian sources, not the Ministry of Defense, have provided us with further updates of the fighting that is now taking place in and around Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians have claimed that they have conducted successful counterattacks in the northeast of Pokrovsk, in the area of the August breakthrough by the Russians. Yesterday, or was it the day before yesterday, they released video footage of a group of Russian soldiers being ambushed by a Ukrainian force in a village called Novotoretskoye, which is immediately to the south of this breakthrough area. There's been much discussion and speculation about what this means. It's been suggested by some that it means that the Ukrainians have broken all the way to this particular village, and that this means that the Russian forces to the north, in places like Kurechny Yar and Zoloty Kolodyaz, are now in effect surrounded. The Russians give no hint of this. As I say many times, I am not there. I do not know factually what is happening. My guess, following on what the Russians have been saying, what newspapers like and outlets in Russia like Radovka, which are very well informed about fighting in the Pokrovsk area, are saying, is that the Ukrainians do not hold any territory in Novotoretskoye at all. Even their control of villages further north, like Vladimirovka, are probably fragmentary and tenuous. But as has happened many times in other places, as happened last year in Kotlino and this year in Toretsk, Ukrainian raiding parties push sometimes through the very fungible front lines and conduct hit-and-run attacks against Russian forces just behind the front lines, and then these are then filmed by overhead Ukrainian drones, and that the film is then republished in order to prove Ukrainian advances. I have no doubt that some of this has been happening. Obviously, I don't know that this was what happened in this particular attack in Novotoretskoye. I would say that the Russian troops who were shown marching, who was ambushed in Novotoretskoye, were seen walking through the village in ways which suggested that they did not expect the Ukrainians to be there, which suggests to me that the Russians do actually have this village under control, and that we are looking at a hit-and-run attack by a Ukrainian raiding party. But of course, that's only my assessment, and obviously, if you want to push back against it, then you're free to do so. For the record, Radovka, the Russian newspaper, consistently the most reliable, as far as I'm concerned, about the fighting in Pokrovsk, says that the Russians have now completely encircled the village of Rodinska, immediately to the north of Pokrovsk, that 2 Ukrainian battalions are trapped in this village, that they're unable to receive supplies, that they're in fact gradually running short of supplies, that there is some other big battle taking place to the northwest around the town of Dobropilia. Again, I know nothing about this, but that is what Radovka says. And that if we're talking about Pokrovsk itself, Russian forces are now concentrating on capturing an industrial area to the northwest of Pokrovsk, which, once captured, will indeed tighten and complete the full encirclement of the town, and will mean that the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk, in south and eastern Pokrovsk, are no longer able to receive supplies. I think that is far and away the most likely account, most realistic account of what is taking place in Pokrovsk. But to repeat again, I am not myself there. Now, of course, you will get none of this from President Zelensky. President Zelensky says that he's going to escalate his war against the Russian refineries, that he's going to prevent Russia from exporting oil. He also is now talking about Ukraine taking the offensive. And there's much speculation about what he means about this, and there's much discussion about another Ukrainian attack somewhere along the front lines, another operation perhaps like the Kursk operation of August last year. Now, it is not impossible, given that we're dealing with Vladimir Zelensky, that he really is planning something like this. And some are suggesting that if there is such a plan, the place which is most likely to be where such an attack happens will this time be Belgorod region, with a Ukrainian incursion and a Ukrainian advance across the border into Belgorod region towards the city of Belgorod. And some are saying that the fact that there has been very heavy Russian bombing of Ukrainian positions across the border in Kharkiv region, across the border from Belgorod region, that means that there is a heavy concentration, a big concentration of Ukrainian troops in this area, ready to push into Kharkiv region. Now, I don't know whether this is indeed the Ukrainian plan, and I don't think anybody can know. It seems to me that if at this stage in the war, Zelensky carries out another operation like the Kharkiv operation, the Kursk operation, though this time in Belgorod, it will simply be a repeat of the Kursk debacle, only worse. The Ukrainians are, by their own accounts now, and their accounts are everywhere. They appear on Telegram channels, in regimental diaries that get published. They are repeated by Ukrainian commentators with information about the front lines. It is universally repeated that the Ukrainian military is extremely short of manpower. There appear to be few, if any, operational reserves left. There have not been any large transfers of armour to Ukraine for some time. Some weeks ago, I heard about a delivery by Australia of Abrams tanks to Ukraine. It may be that these have arrived, and maybe these tanks are being earmarked for this operation into Belgorod region. If so, they will of course be destroyed, and the benefits of this delivery will have been thrown away. I believe I have the actual figures for Ukrainian losses, and by this I mean fatalities, as a result of the Kursk operation. I am not going to say what they are because, as I've said already, I believe that this is confidential and by now perhaps even classified information. And I don't disclose this information for that reason. But I believe I know how heavy Ukrainian losses were in the Kursk operation. And they were eye-wateringly high. Moreover, they were not just extremely high. They were of the same order of magnitude. In fact, they were very similar to the total number of losses the Ukrainians suffered in their summer 2023 offensive, when they tried and failed to cut the Russian land bridge and break through to the Black Sea and to the Sea of Azov. So, Ukraine arguably could not afford that kind of level of losses. Last year, at the time of the Kursk offensive, they certainly cannot afford that kind of level of losses. This time, this year, in any offensive in Belgorod, whatever ephemeral gains the Ukrainians achieve in Belgorod region, it will simply be a greater disaster for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian military. And going back to that article in The Economist, it will, far from being welcomed in Ukraine, such an offensive, far from being welcomed in Ukraine, I suspect all it will do is deepen the already growing sense of despondency and, frankly, despair. Well, that's Zelensky. He might nonetheless do that. He's shown himself throughout this war to be a compulsive gambler, and Ukraine, stuck with a leader like this, well, all I will say is it's not the least of the tragedies that this country, this unhappy country, has experienced. And one of the other things that I have to say I find frustrating about President Trump's words over the last couple of days, his Truth Social posts, the things he said to the media, is that whether intentionally or not, his various words about Ukraine regaining its lost territories, achieving victory on the battlefield, defeating the Russians, all that is going to do is strengthen still further the political position in Kiev of this bankrupt and exhausted man, Vladimir Zelensky. Anyway, there it is. Now, that's what I'm going to say about the conflict in Ukraine today. I suspect that from this point on, at least for the next couple of weeks, the major focus in any discussion of Ukraine is going to be military developments. And I suspect that these will now start to escalate and escalate very quickly. It looks as if, as I said, the Battle of Kupiansk is definitely coming to an end. It is likely that Siversk will follow shortly after. And, well, probably Pokrovsk, because it is a much bigger place, has further to go. But eventually Pokrovsk will fall too. And when Pokrovsk falls, then various things will start to happen much faster, especially if Kupiansk and Liman and Siversk have fallen by then too. But in the meantime, I do want to say some things about the state of the Russian economy again, because not for the first time, I have been reading in various places more articles that are now appearing about how the cracks in the Russian economy are now appearing, and that the situation is again becoming increasingly difficult, and about how President Putin is now running out of money and the Russian government is running out of money, and all of those things. Now, the thing that immediately struck me about these articles, and I've read articles like this in the Financial Times, The Guardian, The Economist, and the Daily Telegraph, and I'm sure that there are similar articles now being written in the European media and in the American media, and they're all articles which presumably echo Donald Trump's view that the Russian economy is on the brink of collapse. Well, what immediately struck me is the way in which Western commentators not only cherry-pick their data, well, they've been doing that for a long time, but they're now starting to cherry-pick entirely different data from the data they were cherry-picking just a few months ago. Now, if we reel back a few months to, say, late spring, then the narrative was of inflation out of control, of sky-high interest rates, of this proving that the cracks were showing. I read in a few places that the banks were on the brink of collapse and might be requiring a bailout, and how Russia seemed to be spiraling towards a condition of hyperinflation. That was the narrative just a few months ago. Well, some of the articles that I have just read, one in the Daily Telegraph immediately stands to mind. It's truly remarkable because it discusses the situation in the Russian economy now without mentioning anything, saying anything about inflation or interest rates at all. This topic, which was dominating the story a few weeks ago, is now gradually fading away. And the reason, of course, is not difficult to judge, because the central bank's interest rate policy, putting up interest rates very high, slowing economic growth in order to end the overheating that the Russian economy was experiencing last year. That policy, it is now widely acknowledged, has succeeded. Inflation in Russia is falling fast. The latest headline figures, the latest annual inflation rate is put at just under 8%. It's fallen below 8%. In the summer, on an annualized basis, prices were growing in Russia at around 4%, which is exactly on target where the central bank is concerned. And the latest projections for the annual figure for inflation in Russia is around 6%, significantly below what was expected at the start of this year. So, inflation in Russia, last year's and the early part of this year's story, is coming down, and it is coming down fast. And the central bank is now confident that inflation will finally reach its 4% target and stay there in the second half of next year. So in 2026, the central bank says that it expects inflation to return definitively to the 4% target. Now, in order to achieve this, there has been a price to pay. And again, I have discussed this in many programs. It's, again, tiresome to have to repeat oneself. But if you keep inflation, if you keep interest rates so high, if you have real interest rates that at times have been at 10%, then inevitably you're going to hit economic growth. And economic growth has fallen rapidly, and that is the purpose of raising interest rates to that level, in order to reduce overheating in the economy, to bring down demand, and to end excess, to mop up excess demand, so as to bring prices down. So the result is that in the second half of this year, growth rate is going to fall, and it is going to fall sharply. And this was always predicted, and it was in fact intended. And if you reduce the growth rate, as is happening, you are going to reduce tax receipts, because if the economy is growing less strongly, then tax receipts are going to be lower than they would have been if the economy had been growing faster. And since the central bank has just made a decision that it is going to wait several months before it reduces interest rates further, many had been expecting a 2 to 6% cut in interest rates this month. But in the event the central bank fully backed by President Putin, only cut interest rates by 1%. If you keep interest rates high, and that inevitably means that growth is going to be lower, that tax receipts are going to be lower, and that leads, all other things being equal, if your spending levels remain the same, to a somewhat higher budget deficit. In Russia's case, there is a further factor at play, which is that the high interest rates and the reduction in economic growth have strengthened the value of the ruble. And that means that receipts from exporters are lower than they would have been. Budget receipts from exporters are lower than they otherwise would have been if the ruble this year had fallen proportionately with oil prices. Then the Russians would have got more rubles for their oil than they have actually done. And that has to some extent hit the budget also. So the central bank and the finance ministry are now penciling in a budget deficit for this year of 2.6% of GDP, which is, for a country like Russia, easily affordable. Now, the person who has commented about this budget is Nabulina, the central bank chair. She has said this: the draft federal budget for 2026-2028 is assessed as disinflationary, and the VAT increase, because the central bank, in order to trim the budget deficit, has increased VAT from 20% to 22%. The VAT increase will have only a short-term impact on price dynamics, but will not be a source of sustained inflationary pressure. We currently assess the draft budget as disinflationary. Yes, a short-term price reaction to the VAT increase is likely, but recall the experience of 2019, when VAT was also increased by 2% and the reaction was moderate. One cannot simply calculate directly that this will translate 1-to-1 into price increases. Back then, VAT increased by 2% and it added 0.6 to 0.7 points to inflation. Even if there is such an effect, it is a temporary one-off effect. It may to some extent affect the speed of decline in inflation expectations, but unlike an increase in the deficit as a possible alternative financed through borrowing, it certainly cannot be a source of sustained inflationary pressure. This is the most important thing. The predictability of budgetary policy is a crucial factor in decisions regarding interest rates, and the fact that certainty has emerged is a very positive factor. I can say right away that for the central bank, a balanced budget is much better than an increase in the deficit would have been. I ought to say that in the period 2026 to 2028, the government expects the budget deficit to fall significantly. This is better for both fiscal sustainability and for inflation and for the level of interest rates. And then she goes into a long technical explanation of why she thinks that will be. And the underlying point that is being made here is that the various steps that the government has been taking with the budget, together with the high interest rates, which have slowed the economy, are enabling a faster than expected reduction in inflation. And what Nabulina is signaling is that this will mean that interest rates will fall faster this year and next year than they would otherwise have done, which over time is certain to lead to higher growth. Now, I say all of this. This is very simple, very obvious economics. It's very obvious in terms of macroeconomic policy. A government running a country with an economy the size of Russia's is not going to be pressed by a budget deficit that hits 2.6% of GDP. I mean, I know a few countries in the West where the budget deficit is as low as that, and next year budget spending will be, the deficit is expected to fall lower, which I am confident that it will. Well, this is normal behavior by finance ministries and governments and central banks. Once upon a time, it would have raised no eyebrows. It would have in fact attracted little interest. Today, the fact that the budget deficit is going to be a bit higher this year than had earlier been expected, and growth is going to be lower this year than had been anticipated earlier this year, when it was expected that the central bank might lower interest rates faster. All of this is now being written up as proving that the Russians are facing some sort of economic crisis. They are not. This is normal rebalancing, such as economies once regularly did in the West as well. In Germany and in Scandinavia and in the United States, and even to some extent in Britain, once upon a time, people understood all this very well. It looks as if today they either no longer do understand it, or they prefer to interpret it otherwise. Anyway, enough of this. Many things are happening elsewhere in the world. And yesterday, reports appeared that a senior Iranian official has spoken about arms deliveries to Iran from Russia. This is actually quite a senior official. He is an MP in the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, and he is apparently either a member or even the chair of an important parliamentary committee in Iran. It seems that he's most likely somebody who therefore knows what he is talking about. Anyway, his words have not been very widely reported, including in Iran itself, by the way. But what he said, briefly, was this. Iran has received from Russia MiG-29 fighter jets. The MiG-29 is a fighter jet developed by the Soviet Union in the 1970s and brought into service in the early 1980s, and it was the Soviet analog of the American F-16. The Iranians are familiar with the MiG-29. It was developed, as I said, in the late 70s, early 80s. Apparently some of them were exported by the Soviet Union to Iraq as a result of the various crises that beset Iraq in its various conflicts with the United States in the early 1990s. Some of those MiG-29s ended up in Iran, and it seems that the Iranians do have some experience with the MiG-29. And it's a reasonable guess that Iranian pilots are able to fly and operate this aircraft, which uses older technologies. Anyway, this Iranian official then went on to say that this delivery of MiG-29s is a stopgap, that eventually they will be replaced with far more powerful and far more sophisticated Sukhoi 35s, which are in the process of eventual delivery. And he also said that advanced S-400 air defense missiles would be delivered also. Now, his words were vague and not always easy to understand, but from what I could tell, he was implying that the Sukhoi 35s and the S-400s have not yet been delivered. Certainly not the Sukhoi 35s, but not the S-400s either. Now, a couple of weeks ago, and I mentioned it at the time in one of my programs, I said that a large number of Iranian military personnel had come to Russia to train on S-400 systems, and that the Russians had made a decision to deliver those systems to Iran. And I'm guessing that the same is happening with the Sukhoi 35, that Iranian pilots are now training on the Sukhoi 35. There's been an enormous amount of dithering and indecision in Iran about whether to take delivery of these weapons, but it looks as if finally the decision has been made. I noted some days ago that the Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces had visited Russia. This was disclosed when this official met, curiously, a senior official in Russia's energy ministries. But I presume this senior Iranian military official was there to discuss military cooperation. And as I've discussed in previous programs, Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei's national security advisor, Ali Larijani, together with Iran's defense minister, visited Russia back in July, had meetings then with the Russian defense minister, Andrei Belousov, and also met with Putin himself. So it does look as if interactions between the Russians and the Iranians are indeed now finally taking place on military deliveries, and that work is being done to move forward with them. Now, my friend Brian Beletic has spoken many times about how long it takes to integrate advanced new weapon systems into a military system that is not familiar with those types of weapons. And in fact, the information I received about the training by the Iranians on the S-400 in Russia is that the Russians believe that it will take the Iranians at least a year to acquire a basic understanding of how to operate this very sophisticated air defense system. And that in order to achieve full proficiency, 2 years of full-time training would be required. With the Sukhoi 35, it might be less than that. But again, we're talking about a complex aircraft, and it could take the Iranians some time to learn how to operate and understand it and to make the most of its capabilities. Iran has left this very late. It ought to have been clear years ago, in my opinion, that a clash with Israel and the United States was only a matter of time. I discussed this in several programs, but Iran, for reasons I fully understand but don't agree with, nonetheless, for too long, sought to go it alone. There are reports that the Iranians are re-establishing the production lines for their ballistic missiles. There are problems, apparently, with rocket fuel for the engines. The facilities to sort this out have not yet been fully repaired, but the Iranians are feverishly working on that too. Step by step, Iran is trying to rearm and prepare itself for the battle with Israel and the United States, which I have no doubt will soon come. What is less clear to me is whether any of this help, which, as I said, can only really have a bearing, an effect on the military situation in a year, 2 years from now, will come soon enough to enable Iran to withstand the blow that is to come. We shall see. My guess is that Iran retains enough resilience and depth of resources to be able to absorb the blow. I suspect that they clearly do have fewer missiles than they did back during the 12-day war in June. Ballistic missiles, that is. But I suspect that they still have enough to mete out heavy blows to the Israelis. But clearly they are short of time, and they will have to work very, very hard in order to get themselves ready. And they may have to accept that over the course of the next blow, they will suffer damage and will not be able to inflict commensurate damage upon the Israelis and the Americans who are striking at them. Having said this, the calculus will be the same as it was in June. If the Israelis, backed by the United States, cannot deal a decisive blow against Iran within the first 10 days or 2 weeks, then the balance of the pendulum will swing back in Iran's favor because of the enormous discrepancy in size of these two countries and Iran's ability to organize and absorb the blows. So I think Iran does have the necessary resiliency, and it does finally seem to be preparing for the long term. Now, here I would say, of course, just to end, that one must assume that what this Iranian official is saying is true. There's deep skepticism about the truth of what he's saying. Forbes has published an article, for example, in which they completely, entirely discount his claims. They question whether the Russians have really supplied MiG-29s, whether Sukhoi 35s and S-400s are really on the way. I believe that these reports are indeed true. I've been following carefully the interactions between the Iranians and the Russians over the last few months, and I've been getting information from within Russia about Iranians training on the S-400 system. And of course, I'm mindful that Putin himself has already confirmed that Russia did offer Iran a complete air defense system, and that it was Iran that spurned the offer. So I believe that all of this is happening. It is consistent with the information that I am getting. And of course, it is consistent with the overwhelming likelihood that we must now all prepare for over the next few weeks, that there will be a renewed conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran. Well, this is where I finish today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.